Hi everyone. I'm going to demo for you today how to work with the Encounters data entry sheet and log interactions that you have with your patient. I should note that I'm demoing this in version 1.1, so if you're using 1.0, things may look a little bit different, and we definitely recommend that you upgrade your version. So I'm starting here in my home screen, and I can go to Document and Encounter and click on Encounters information to jump me to the Encounters data entry sheet. So since this is a little bit more complex than some of the other sections, I just want to go through all the different elements and make sure you have a firm understanding of everything in detail before going through an example as you would enter data in real life. So in the Encounters data entry sheet, the first thing that you would need to do is select a patient from the drop-down so that PNBot knows who you're talking about. And then if you want to add a new encounter, you can choose to do that here, or you can update an existing encounter if you want to change the details of something that you already entered in the past. So for now, I'm going to click on Add a New Encounter, which will expand out all my data entry fields. Now, usually data entry should go fairly quickly, but I just want to go through some of these fields in greater detail. So all these gray boxes are filled out for you, and you don't really need to worry about them. This is just some identifying information pulled from the patient data entry section. The case ID is automatically filled out based on your patient's most recent case number. And then encounter ID is a number that is automatically assigned to this specific encounter and uniquely identifies this encounter as this encounter or no other encounter, and that you also don't need to worry about because it just sequentially gets generated by PNBot. Okay, so the next field, or section of fields rather, is encounter information, which details some of the elements of the encounter that you have with the patient. So encounter date is required. That's why this field is blue. And it automatically defaults to today's date. But let's say you're back entering data and the encounter actually happened last week. That's no problem. You can just click in that cell to bring up your calendar widget and select a different date. So in this case, I'm going to select August 8th as the date that the encounter actually happened. And then the next field that I have here is encounter type, which describes the channel of communication that I used for this encounter. So was it an in-person visit with the patient, or did I call them, did I email or text or send a physical mail to them or fax them or something else? And lastly, the last option you can choose is no encounter, other action on patient's behalf. And I just wanted to draw your attention to this option because you may be thinking, why would I log something that isn't actually a patient interaction? And that may be because you wish to keep track of something that happened or take credit for time that you spent on providing patient services that don't actually involve interacting with the patient directly. So, for example, if you're trying to get your patient into a shelter for the duration of their chemo, you may be on the phone with the social service agency for 30 minutes to try to figure out those details. And you might want to log what you all talked about and what happened as a result of that conversation, and also take credit for that time later on, even though you didn't talk to the patient directly. So in cases like that, you have the option to select no encounter, other action on patient's behalf. But it may perhaps be more common to select other options like in-person or phone call for instances where you do meet with the patient or call the patient. So the next three fields over here are actually optional fields. So depending on how you set things up in the setup sheet that I'm going to jump to real quick, you may or may not see those fields. So in the setup sheet, what information does your program want to collect about each navigation encounter? You had the option to check off or unselect navigation staff, minutes spent on encounter, or data follow-up needed. So depending on whether your program chose to opt in or out, you'll see these fields or you won't see these fields. Jumping back to encounters data entry, in this case, I do have these fields selected. So navigation staff, I can just type in my name here. And if it's important to my program to count things by navigation staff, I would just want to make sure to enter my name consistently every time that I do an encounter, so things get counted together. But if, on the other hand, your program only has one navigator, this navigation staff field may not be important, and your program may opt out of this variable in the setup sheet that I just showed you. Minutes spent on encounter is a drop-down list, also an optional variable where you can select from this drop-down anywhere between 2 and 180 minutes for how much time you spent on this encounter. And, it's meant to really just be a rough estimate, providing some round numbers for that. And this field may be of interest if you're trying to demonstrate navigation effort or the amount of time that it takes to go through a lot of these encounters, especially if you're trying to demonstrate the value of your work to other people and what you all are spending your time on. There are a number of reports tied to minutes spent on encounter that you may wish to peruse in the reports list as well. So data follow-up is also an optional field. It's a date type field, so if I click in here, it brings up the calendar widget, and I can specify for myself a date that I would like to follow up by. So for example, I can select August 23rd as my follow-up date, whether that's because it's the next time my patient has an appointment or if it's just been about 2 weeks since my last action, so I should just check to make sure things are running smoothly. I can use this data follow-up field to remind myself later on. So I'm going to navigate away from here for a moment back to my home screen. So if I wanted to use these buttons here for see follow-up needed, then it would be important for me to use the data follow-up field. And then I also have a general notes field where I can just write notes for myself, including reminders of what my follow-up is for and what to do. But this isn't really used for any sort of quantitative report or analysis. It's just notes for my own purposes as a navigator. So next, we also have this outcomes information area here. And this is a bit tricky, so I just want to make sure that we go through this in great detail. So what outcomes were achieved through navigation? And I can click on this button to add outcomes. And basically, you're asked to select as many outcomes as you want over here that were achieved since the last encounter. So basically, if I haven't already noted somewhere that something happened, like for example, my patient got enrolled in a clinical trial, then I would definitely want to check it off here to note that if that's something that happened since the last encounter that hasn't been noted yet. Since outcomes will also have a report attached to it that will count the number of outcomes that have been achieved through navigation services, it's important to not be redundant in this regard as well. What do I mean by that? So, for example, if you had to help a patient with Medicaid and Marketplace enrollment, and it took you 5 different encounters to achieve that result, you just want to make sure that if you logged 5 encounters for that patient, that you don't check off that Medicaid Marketplace enrollment was achieved 5 times, because then in a report, it would look like you got people into Medicaid Marketplace on 5 separate instances, when really it was just 5 encounters that needed to happen to get 1 instance of Medicaid Marketplace enrollment. Okay, so that's just something to be mindful of. Please only check these off once they've actually been achieved on a unique instance. And then once you check off what you would like, you can go ahead and click OK, and you can see the outcomes listed over here in summary. So this is sort of just a quirk of PNBot to be aware of. If you decide, that you check something off by mistake and you want to undo it, you can backspace to delete it from here. But to make sure that it gets actually deleted, you would have to go into click to add outcomes, not select anything, and then click OK. Because clicking OK is what sort of actually sets whether or not something has been achieved or not. Okay, so I would have to click OK to actually delete everything. And you may notice that, if I click to add outcomes over here and I clicked 2 things, if I forgot that I wanted to add one more thing and I go back to click outcomes, nothing's checked off anymore. It didn't stay checked. So really, how things get saved is the very last time that you checked everything off and hit OK. That last OK click is what determines what actually gets saved into the system. So I just want you all to be aware of that. So if you wanted to add a third thing to adherence and hospice, you would have to delete out this box, click to add outcomes, and select everything again. And I might want to select these other 2 things, let's say. And then I click OK, and then those 4 outcomes would get saved. Okay? So that's just one little confusing aspect that I just wanted to be really clear about. And then the next section is sort of the center of PNBot in a way, because this table down here summarizes all of the patient's barriers and actions. So basically, one row here, if you're using version 1.1, equals 1 unique barrier that the patient has ever encountered. So you see here that in this row, I have physical comorbidities/disabilities listed as a barrier, even though I haven't even added anything at all during this encounter as a barrier. And that's because on a previous encounter that I entered before, I had entered this barrier for this patient, number 1 first example patient. So PNBot remembers that, and every single time that I want to add a new encounter, it'll pull all the old barriers that I've ever entered to sort of remind me that, hey, this has been an issue in the past. Did you do something for it this time? Has there been a change in status? Would you like to write additional notes to provide any sort of update for that barrier? And that's what happens. Whereas if you're using version 1, you may see 1 row per update to a barrier, which we did not intend for version 1, so it's been fixed in version 1.1, where in this table at the bottom here, 1 row equals 1 unique barrier per patient. Okay, so what are we logging for each barrier? The first is barrier number, which is automatically assigned. So physical comorbidities/disabilities is the first barrier ever logged for this patient. And then there are up to 2 actions that you can specify per encounter, per barrier. And what you see in the drop-downs for these 2 fields will depend on what barrier is listed in that row. So specific to comorbidities and disabilities, I can connect patient with occupational or physical therapy professionals, for example, or I could put, resource referral or whatever the case may be. So you will only see actions that pertain to this barrier in the 2 drop-downs over here. Current status is also a drop-down, so I can either say, not improved, still a barrier. If, for example, we started to get some paperwork done to address this barrier, but nothing's actually changed yet, this is still definitely a barrier for the patient, I would put not improved, still a barrier. I might also put this if there just simply aren't resources for the patient or things just haven't improved. The next option is improved, less of a barrier. If something has been done to fix the barrier, but it's not completely gone, it's just a little bit mitigated. And the next option is removed/addressed short-term, but it might be a future barrier. So what we mean by that is, the barrier is removed right now, but maybe it was just a stopgap measure, and it's something to be on the lookout for in the future because it isn't completely solved, whatever the barrier is. And then there is removed addressed long-term, no longer a barrier, like we completely don't need to worry about this anymore. We have reason to believe that things are fixed long-term. And then I could also write notes specific to this barrier for myself over here. And then the next few fields are automatically filled out. So new barrier, no or yes, you generally shouldn't really touch these guys over here. Because they get filled out for you already. So barriers that were pulled from previous encounters will default to no. If I added a new barrier, it would default to yes. And then it also pulls the date that the barrier was first encountered. So I had previously entered on July 18th an encounter that included physical disabilities and comorbidities. So that's what this date stamp is for. And date last updated, I haven't updated it since I added it, so it's also July 18th, and the category of barrier is care coordination. So all this is automatically assigned, and I don't need to worry about that. Now, if I had made changes to this barrier during this present encounter, and it looks like I have, like I said that I did these two actions to address this barrier, and I updated the status and wrote some notes, to save any of the changes, it's really important that for the row that I want to change, I change save updates for this barrier from no to yes. And it's highlighted in yellow because it's really important to pay attention to. Because if I left this as no and I made all these changes and I went ahead and saved this encounter up here, then I'd be in trouble because my changes would not get saved, okay? It only saves things that say yes for save updates to this barrier. Because, you know, what if we had pulled this barrier from before to remind you that this had been a past barrier, but I had nothing new to report, or I didn't do anything this time to address this barrier, then I would have just left this row alone and I would have just left this as no, and it wouldn't have gotten updated. Okay, so that's how you, in a new encounter, say that you did something to address a previously identified encounter or update a previously identified encounter. Now, if during today's encounter we identified some brand new, never before seen barriers for this patient, how would I add those? What I would do is use these 8 buttons over here to choose a category of barrier to add. So these 8 buttons are only going to be used for adding brand new barriers, not updates and not anything else, just new barriers. So let's say my patient, for the first time during this encounter, told me that they had an issue with transportation. Transportation is a logistical barrier. So what I'm going to do is click on logistical, and that brings up all the logistical barriers, and I'm going to click on transportation, but I can select more than one if I'd like. So for example purposes, let's say transportation and utilities are both barriers, and I'm going to click OK. And everything I check off is going to get added to this barriers table. And note how save updates defaults to yes, because these are new barriers. I definitely want to save anything that I write about these new barriers. So the barrier name, I see gets updated over here. And going across to action, for the transportation barrier, I see things like cab, Uber, other rideshare assistance, or parking assistance, for example. And let's say my current status is it's improved, less of a barrier. And I could write a note like application for parking assistance submitted today, or whatever the case may be. And similarly for utilities, I can, you know, provide financial assistance for utilities, or maybe a resource referral, or whatever the case may be, and add a different current status. So let's say not improved, for example. And then note here, new barrier, all this gets filled out automatically, and it defaults to yes. Date first encountered and last updated defaults to the date of this encounter, and the category also automatically gets populated based on the button over here. Okay, so that's essentially how this bottom table works. And I realize that there are a lot of different things that can go wrong during the course of a patient's treatment, and there's so many barriers, and each barrier has so many different actions that you could do for them. So if you're ever not sure which category button to click on in order to add a new barrier, what you can do is click on this little PNBot friend where it says click me to see a full list of all possible barriers and actions, and that will jump me to my reference sheet of list of category barrier and action response options. And this has the entire list of every single barrier and action category included in PNBot. So why this is helpful is I can hit Control F to do a find. So let's say that I knew that my patient had a transportation barrier, but I didn't know that it was in logistical. I'm not sure where to look. So I could just type in transportation, hit enter or find next, and it takes me to transportation over here, and I can see all the actions associated with it. And if I scroll up and look to the left, I see here that it's under the logistical category. Okay, and to go back to Encounters data entry, I can just click on PNBot Friend again. And generally, it's really important that anytime you navigate away from a sheet that has unsaved data, you always remember to go back and save it so that you don't lose that information the next time the form gets cleared. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Save. And then I get confirmation, encounter saved. I can click OK. So if I wanted to double check and see what's saved, I can go to see full list of encounters, and that'll take me to here. So I can see here, first example patient, the encounter ID is 3, the date of encounter was August 8th, and all the details here, including my notes and follow-up and all of that. And I just want to show you what it looks like if I wanted to update. So I select the patient again. I can click on Update an Existing Encounter, and I see here that I had my 2 different encounters that were previously entered, and this would populate with a whole list of all the encounters I've ever entered for this patient. So let's say that I wanted to update the last one that we just entered for August 8th. I would select it here. It has the encounter ID in the first column, the date of the encounter in the second column, and the type or mode of communication for the third column. So, to help me identify it, and I would click OK. And that would, again, expand out all my fields with all the information that I had entered before, including the specific updates that I had over here. So that's generally how it works. And just to show you, since we're a little bit more familiar with first example patient, what if I wanted to add yet another encounter for first example patient? I click on Add a New Encounter, and you see here all these barriers that entered before have populated in this table, defaulting to no for save updates, and my actions are blank. But the current status in the notes still got pulled from the last time. So for version 1.1, you should only see physical comorbidities/disabilities one time. It's a unique barrier. In version 1, because of the bug, you'll see 1 row per update. So if I wanted to update this, I would just go ahead and click no to yes and add my additional actions and change the status, etc. If you're using version 1.0 where you have multiple rows, it's important that you only put yes for save updates for 1 row of that barrier and not all of them, and that the one that you select yes for is the most recent update. So that's one issue with version 1.0. So please use version 1.1. So basically, you can tell when it was last updated over here. New barriers defaulted to no. Okay, so that's essentially the interface. And oh, one more thing I wanted to show you was, of course, this is left blank now for actions, and that's because if I did want to provide an update here, I didn't necessarily do these two actions from last time again. So just to avoid entry error, that's why we left the action columns blank for this table over here. But let's say I forgot, what I did last time and I want to see what I did. One way to note that is to go to this button over here, see patient's full history of previous barrier statuses and actions. So if I click on that button, it'll take me to the barriers history list, and notice that client ID is filtered to only this patient, and I can see, if I scroll over to the right, all the updates. So that includes over here the dates of encounter, and note that there are 3 entries for the 8th, and that's because we had 3 barrier updates on the 8th. So the barrier names are over here. The date that the barrier was updated is over here, and I can see my actions 1 and 2 for each of the days, and also keep track of the status so I can track any changes that happened over time. Okay? And then I always want to use this button to click back to Encounters Data Entry to continue what I'm doing. One other thing I would like to note about the Encounters Data Entry sheet that might be a little confusing is that because of the showing and hiding of the different rows here, the buttons to preserve where they are and to make them function properly, one workaround we had to do in the programming is to expand everything on save. So if you save the file on any other sheet, anywhere, it doesn't really matter where you are, if you hit save while entering data, that expands out all the fields. So just don't be confused if you see that, okay? And it may still say things from before, but basically as soon as you select a different patient and go through, you would have to click the button. That still resets everything. So, you won't see the other patients, previous enter patients information anymore. Okay, so that's basically how this data interface works. So I'm just going to start from scratch and go through at more of a real-life pace for how you would enter data here. So let's say we're working with second example patient. I want to add a new encounter. My encounter date is yesterday, and it was a phone call. I'm going to write my name. And I spent 5 minutes. And I want to schedule follow-up for myself on the 22nd. What outcomes were achieved? My patient received a survivorship care plan. I'll click OK, and that's about it. Maybe I don't have notes today. And I can say that there was one communication education barrier, about information needs, questions, understanding. I'll click OK and just say that I provided the patient with some written information. And then the barrier was improved. And that's it. I would just click Save. And I'm done entering my encounter. Okay, so that's essentially it. I hope that with time and a little bit of practice, it becomes fairly straightforward to do. Thank you for watching.